The morning light filtering through Ruby's lace curtains felt different somehow. Harsher. More revealing. I stood in her kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching my sister Brooke rifle through cabinets like she was conducting an inventory for an estate sale. The funeral had ended exactly 3 hours and 14 minutes earlier, and here she was, already calculating the value of our grandmother's belongings with the efficiency of a professional appraiser. Looking back now, I can pinpoint that moment as when everything changed. When I stopped being the family doormat and started being someone who documented everything with the methodical precision that had served me through 35 years as a corporate auditor. My phone was already recording from my jacket pocket. Old habits from investigating financial irregularities at work. Always gather evidence first, ask questions later. Protect yourself from accusations of misremembering or exaggerating. Ruby Blackwood had passed peacefully in her sleep at 89, leaving behind more than anyone in our family had expected. The downtown property portfolio she'd quietly assembled over 6 decades was worth $11.8 million. 11 rental buildings, the historic diner that bore her name, prime commercial real estate that developers had been circling like vultures for years, and a handful of empty lots she'd purchased during economic downturns when nobody else saw their potential. She'd left it all to me. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family members who'd avoided Ruby like she carried something contagious suddenly materialized the moment dirt hit her casket. Brooke had driven in from Chicago with her real estate agent swagger and designer grief outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mason, my cousin, had managed to drag himself away from whatever business venture was currently failing to grace us with his presence. Both of them had spent the funeral service checking their phones and whispering about property values while I delivered the eulogy Ruby had asked me to write. "The crystal collection has to be worth at least $20,000, Brooke said to Mason, not bothering to lower her voice despite my presence 15 feet away. "And did you see the jewelry box upstairs? Some of those pieces looked genuinely antique. The cameo alone could be worth several thousand." I'd spent the last 18 months caring for Ruby while these two lived their Instagram-perfect lives in willful ignorance of her declining health. Neither had visited once during her final illness. Not when she was diagnosed with pneumonia that turned into a month-long struggle. Not when she spent 2 weeks in the hospital fighting respiratory complications. Not when I was sleeping on a cot beside her bed, managing her medications, advocating with doctors who seemed determined to dismiss her symptoms as normal aging, researching treatment options online at 3 in the morning. But here they were now, 3 hours after we'd said goodbye, treating her home like a liquidation sale preview. The disrespect made my chest tight with something that went beyond grief into pure anger. My engineering background had taught me to observe systems before acting, to understand the mechanisms at work before attempting repairs. Family dynamics, I'd learned over 4 decades of reluctant participation, followed predictable patterns when money entered the equation. Greed had its own mathematics, its own internal logic that could be mapped and predicted. I pulled out my phone and began recording more deliberately, angling it to capture both their words and their actions. "Harper." Brooke appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from calculation to practiced sympathy with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd made a career selling people things they couldn't afford. "We need to talk about Ruby's estate. The property management is going to be incredibly complicated for someone without extensive business experience." I'd been managing Ruby's rental properties for 3 years, collecting rent from 23 units across downtown, handling maintenance requests that came at all hours, dealing with tenant emergencies that ranged from broken pipes to domestic disputes, mediating conflicts between neighbors, coordinating repairs with contractors who'd learned to respect Ruby's standards, managing the books with software I'd designed myself to track everything from utility costs to capital improvements. But Brooke had always treated my early retirement from corporate auditing as if I'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown, rather than made a deliberate choice to prioritize time and autonomy over salary and status. In her worldview, stepping away from corporate advancement meant stepping away from competence entirely. "The probate attorney is handling everything according to Ruby's will," I said, watching Mason pocket one of Ruby's antique silver spoons when he thought I wasn't looking. The spoon had been a wedding gift from Ruby's mother in 1952. "Nothing needs to be decided today." "Actually, Harper, it does." Brooke produced a thick folder from her designer handbag with the flourish of a magician revealing the climax of a trick. "Mason and I have been consulting with our attorney about the complexities involved." Given the property values we're dealing with here, and the liability issues, you're going to need professional oversight and protection. The folder contained documents I recognized immediately from my auditing days. Competency evaluations, conservatorship petitions, financial management agreements requiring oversight by a family trust administered by Brooke, with Mason as secondary administrator. All requiring my signature to transfer effective control of Ruby's estate to them while leaving me with legal liability for any problems. The legal language was dense and intimidating, clearly designed to overwhelm someone without financial background. Unfortunately for them, I had exactly that background, plus years of experience detecting sophisticated fraud schemes that often began with exactly this type of documentation. You've been planning this for months, I said, scanning the preparation dates on the legal paperwork. The earliest documents were dated 6 months ago, right around the time Ruby's pneumonia diagnosis had made her mortality suddenly real to everyone. We've been worried about you, Harper, Mason added, finally looking up from his systematic photography of Ruby's china cabinet. His phone camera flash reflected off the antique glass as he documented each piece. Living alone out here in this big house, no steady income since you retired early. This level of financial responsibility might be overwhelming for someone in your situation. My situation: 18 months of careful financial planning to ensure Ruby's comfort and dignity during her final illness was being dismissed as overwhelming responsibility. 3 years of successful property management that had increased rental income by 12% while maintaining affordable rates was being ignored completely. 35 years of corporate financial expertise, including a decade specializing in fraud investigation and asset protection, was being treated as irrelevant ancient history. I'll need time to review these documents thoroughly, I said, noting how both of them tensed at the word thoroughly. People with legitimate proposals didn't fear thorough review. Of course you do, sweetheart, Brooke said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension she'd perfected in childhood, when explaining to me why her needs should take priority over mine. But we'll need your decision by Friday. Mason's facing some urgent financial pressures, and we need to get the property management transition started as quickly as possible to protect everyone's interests. Friday was 4 days away, just enough time to make me feel consulted and considered, not enough time for proper legal review or consultation with independent counsel. It was classic manipulation timing, something I'd seen countless times in corporate settings when executives tried to rush through questionable financial decisions before oversight committees could examine them properly. Mason shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with how explicitly Brooke had connected his financial problems to the estate timeline. It's not just about me, Harper, he said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who'd been caught in an uncomfortable truth. Ruby's properties need active management. The downtown market is changing rapidly. With all the development pressure and zoning changes, opportunities could be missed if we don't act decisively. Opportunities, that was interesting phrasing, and it told me everything I needed to know about their actual intentions. Ruby had been very specific about wanting her properties maintained as affordable housing for working families. She'd turned down 3 separate offers from developers in the past 2 years, preferring to keep rents reasonable rather than maximize profits. The last offer had been for $8 million, which would have displaced 43 families. Somehow I doubted that Mason and Brooke shared her commitment to social responsibility over financial gain. What kind of opportunities are you thinking about? I asked, keeping my voice neutral while my phone continued recording. Brooke and Mason exchanged a look that confirmed my suspicions. Well, Brooke said, carefully, there are some zoning changes coming that could significantly increase property values, mixed-use development, higher density allowances, the kind of improvements that could benefit the whole community. The whole community, code words for displacing current tenants with luxury developments that most working families couldn't afford. After they left, taking with them several small items they claimed held sentimental value but which I suspected held primarily monetary value, I called my attorney, Sarah, who'd handled Ruby's estate planning for the past 5 years. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with genuine condolence.
Harper, I'm so sorry about Ruby. She was an extraordinary woman, and I know how much she meant to you.
Thank you, Sarah. She was the strongest person I've ever known, but I need you to review some documents that Brooke and Mason want me to sign. They're pushing for a quick decision.
Already? The will hasn't even been filed with probate yet. That's highly unusual.
That's exactly what concerns me. They had these documents prepared months ago. I photographed each page of their legal documents and emailed them to Sarah while we stayed on the phone. The silence stretched as she reviewed them, broken only by occasional sharp intakes of breath and what sounded like muttered profanity in what might have been Mandarin.
Harper, don't sign anything.
She said finally, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd seen these tactics before. These documents would essentially give Brooke complete control over the estate while making you personally liable for any debts, legal issues, or financial losses. You'd retain title but lose all actual authority. It's a sophisticated way to access the properties while insulating themselves from any risks or responsibilities.
Is this legal?
Unfortunately, yes. It's a recognized form of estate management typically used when beneficiaries lack capacity or experience. But it's completely inappropriate in your situation.
Can they force this through probate court?
Not if you object with proper legal representation, but they might try other approaches. Financial exploitation of family members often begins with exactly this kind of pressure campaign. I strongly recommend you start documenting every interaction you have with them from this point forward. I wasn't elderly or incapacitated, but I understood her point. Patterns of financial manipulation rarely started with outright theft. They began with gradual erosion of decision-making authority, justified by manufactured concerns about competency or overwhelming responsibility. Once control was established, the actual looting could begin. That evening, I sat at Ruby's kitchen table with my laptop, surrounded by financial records I'd maintained meticulously for years. 35 years of corporate auditing had taught me that patterns of behavior became crystal clear when properly documented and analyzed. I labeled the first tab, Financial History, and began entering data I'd been tracking informally, wondering if I'd see connections I'd missed when viewed individually. Mason's pattern emerged first, stark and undeniable when displayed in chronological order. Emergency loan requests every 6 to 8 months for the past 4 years, always between $8,000 and $15,000. Always accompanied by elaborate explanations about temporary cash flow issues from business ventures that seemed to fail with remarkable consistency. Always with promises of quick repayment that never materialized. The oil change franchise that failed after 8 months, requiring $12,000 to cover outstanding debts to suppliers and landlords. The food truck venture that lasted 3 months before Mason discovered he hated the restaurant business, needing $10,000 for equipment liens and permit fees. The cryptocurrency investment opportunity that turned out to be a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, costing $15,000 that Mason had borrowed from multiple sources. The house flipping partnership that collapsed when his partner disappeared with the renovation funds, leaving Mason responsible for another $8,000 in contractor bills and permit violations. Each failure was followed by a period of shame and promises to never ask for money again. Then 6 months would pass, and a new opportunity would emerge, requiring just enough capital to get started. The cycle was so predictable I could have set a calendar by it. Total amount loaned to Mason over 4 years, Al-Kihab, $87,000. Total amount repaid, $0. Brooke's financial pattern was more sophisticated, revealing a different kind of manipulation entirely. She'd never asked for direct loans, instead arranging for me to pay for what she presented as shared family expenses that we should split equitably among Ruby's grandchildren. Ruby's medical bills that should have been divided 3 ways among grandchildren, but somehow always ended up charged to my credit card, because I was the only one with reliable income. Family holiday gatherings where I covered everything from venue rental to catering, because you're in the best position to handle the upfront costs, Harper, and we'll settle up later. Her son Jake's private school tuition that became my responsibility when her real estate commissions dropped during the market downturn, presented as a temporary arrangement that had lasted 2 years. The medical expenses alone totaled $38,000 over 3 years. I'd paid for specialist consultations, physical therapy, prescription medications, medical equipment, and home modifications to help Ruby maintain independence. Brooke had contributed exactly nothing while posting photos of spa weekends and wine tastings on Instagram. Holiday costs added another $18,000. Family gatherings at expensive restaurants where Brooke would order wine that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week, then disappear when the check arrived. Elaborate birthday celebrations for Jake that I'd funded while Brooke took credit for organizing. Educational expenses for Jake, including not just tuition but also summer camps, sports equipment, private tutoring, and college preparation courses, came to $26,000. I'd been told repeatedly that supporting Jake's education was an investment in our family's future, while Brooke used her income for luxury purchases that she documented extensively on social media. Total amount paid for Brooke's family expenses over 3 years, $82,000. Total amount reimbursed, $0. Combined total family financial support over 4 years, $169,000. I stared at the screen, feeling something cold and analytical cutting through the grief for the first time since Ruby's death. $169,000. More than many people earned in 3 years. More than most people had in savings. These were the people questioning my financial competency and judgment. These were the family members who thought I needed professional oversight to manage Ruby's estate. The spreadsheet revealed more than just monetary amounts. It showed a systematic pattern of psychological manipulation designed to make me feel responsible for their financial well-being, while they took credit for any successes and avoided responsibility for failures. I'd been conditioned to see their requests as family loyalty tests rather than financial exploitation. Tuesday morning found me at the county courthouse, pulling property records and financial filings with the thoroughness of a professional investigation. Real estate transactions were public information, and my auditing background made navigating the records system straightforward. What I discovered filled in missing pieces of the financial puzzle I'd been unconsciously assembling for years. Mason owned a house purchased 18 months ago for $280,000. The down payment had been $56,000, paid exactly 6 weeks after I'd advanced him $15,000 for what he'd described as critical equipment for the new landscaping business that's finally going to turn everything around. The timing wasn't coincidental. My loan had been leveraged into a much larger down payment, probably combined with additional borrowed funds from other sources he hadn't mentioned. The house was currently listed for sale at $340,000. Despite Mason having done no significant improvements beyond basic maintenance. He was trying to flip it for a $60,000 profit using my money as the initial investment. Money I'd never see again unless I took legal action to enforce collection. Brooke's financial records painted an even more troubling picture of sophisticated financial irresponsibility. 3 separate property transactions in 2 years, each financed through different lenders with minimal down payments and maximum debt ratios. She owned properties worth over $1 million on paper but carried mortgages totaling $800,000. Her monthly debt service exceeded her average commission income by almost $2,000. The properties were all in trendy neighborhoods with high potential for appreciation, but they required constant cash injections for maintenance, improvements, and periods of vacancy between tenants. Brooke was essentially gambling that property values would increase fast enough to cover her negative cash flow indefinitely. She was financially overextended to a degree that would have triggered immediate intervention in any corporate setting I'd audited. One missed commission check, one major repair expense, one market downturn, one change in interest rates could trigger a cascade of foreclosures that would destroy her credit and leave her bankrupt. Both Mason and Brooke were facing potential financial ruin without continued family support. Ruby's death had triggered their desperation because they knew my willingness to subsidize their lifestyles was ending with her passing. They needed control of her estate not just for the money, but for the ongoing income stream that could support their unsustainable spending patterns indefinitely. Wednesday afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting, though it came earlier than I'd predicted. Mason's voice carried the practiced desperation of someone who'd made this type of request many times before, but with an added edge of genuine panic that suggested his situation was more urgent than usual. "Harper, I hate to bother you when you're grieving, but I'm facing a genuine emergency situation here. The business loan payment is due Friday morning, and a major client payment got delayed until next month due to some bureaucratic complications. Could you advance me $12,000? I'll pay it back immediately from the estate distribution, with interest if you want." The estate distribution that he and Brooke wanted to control through their family trust arrangement. "Mason, I can't advance estate money before probate is complete. That would be illegal and could jeopardize the entire inheritance." "It wouldn't be estate money, Harper. It would be from your personal funds like always. Just until the estate gets settled and I can access my inheritance portion, you know I'm good for it. Like always." He'd accidentally revealed the core assumption underlying all his previous requests. My financial support wasn't temporary assistance between family members during difficult periods. It was a permanent resource he expected to access whenever needed, as reliable as a bank account or credit line. I'll need to think about it, Mason. Harper, you don't understand the time pressure here. If this loan defaults, I could lose everything. My credit rating, my business accounts, my house. The late fees alone will cost me hundreds of dollars every day. You wouldn't want that to happen to family, would you? The guilt manipulation was so textbook I almost laughed. Family loyalty as a weapon when he needed money, business competency as ammunition when I had money to manage. The psychological pattern was as predictable as his financial irresponsibility. I said, I'll think about it, Mason. Think fast, Harper. The payment is due Friday morning at 9 a.m., and banks don't care about family emergencies or funeral timing. I hung up and immediately added the conversation details to my spreadsheet, including direct quotes. The urgency in his voice suggested this wasn't just another manufactured crisis. He was genuinely facing financial collapse, which explained the timing of their estate management proposal. Then I called my bank to discuss additional security measures for my accounts. If Mason was desperate enough to pressure me during Ruby's funeral week, he might be desperate enough to attempt more direct access to my funds. Thursday morning brought Brooke to my door, unannounced but bearing gifts with the calculated spontaneity of a politician making a campaign stop. Coffee and pastries from Riverside Bakery, downtown's most expensive breakfast spot. The gesture would have cost $45, money she'd claim she didn't have if I asked about reimbursement for any of the $82,000 in family expenses I'd covered. I brought your favorites, she said, settling at Ruby's kitchen table like she belonged there. Chocolate croissants and that fancy Ethiopian coffee you love. I thought we should talk about our family's future, away from all the legal complexity and paperwork. She launched into what was clearly a prepared presentation about shared responsibility and family legacy. How Ruby would have wanted us to work together. How the property management would benefit from Brooke's real estate expertise and Mason's local business connections. How we could honor Ruby's memory by building something bigger and more successful than any of us could achieve individually. The presentation was polished and persuasive, hitting emotional notes about family unity while painting a picture of expanded business opportunities. But I noticed she never mentioned Ruby's actual wishes about maintaining affordable housing, or her specific instructions about keeping the community character of downtown intact. What about the management experience I've already gained over the past 3 years? I asked. Oh, Harper, you've done wonderfully as a caretaker during Ruby's illness. But now we're talking about real business decisions, property development opportunities, market timing, investor relations, zoning variance applications. Ruby was a sweet woman, but she was from a different generation. She didn't understand modern property values or development potential. Property development, that phrase cut through everything else she'd said, revealing the true motivation behind their urgency. They weren't planning to maintain Ruby's rental properties according to her wishes. They were planning to sell them to developers or redevelop them themselves for maximum profit. Ruby specifically wanted those properties kept as affordable housing for working families. I said. That's exactly what I mean, Harper. Ruby was sentimental about keeping rents low, but she was leaving money on the table every month. These properties could generate 3 times their current income with proper management and strategic improvements. Strategic improvements. Code words for displacing current tenants with rent increases they couldn't afford, then renovating units for higher income renters willing to pay market rates for downtown living. The current tenants have been there for years, some of them for decades. They consider these places home. And they've had a good run, haven't they? But markets change, Harper. We have to adapt or get left behind. Ruby couldn't bring herself to make tough business decisions, but we can honor her memory by making the properties financially successful, instead of just break-even operations. The casual dismissal of Ruby's values and the lives of her tenants crystallized everything I needed to know about Brooke's true intentions. Ruby had spent 60 years building a legacy of affordable housing in downtown. Her tenants included teachers, nurses, shop clerks, restaurant workers, retired people on fixed incomes. People who'd been priced out of most downtown housing as gentrification drove rents beyond the reach of working families. Ruby's properties were among the last affordable options in downtown, and she'd kept them that way deliberately, viewing housing as a human right rather than just a business opportunity. I'm not signing the management transfer documents, I said quietly. Brooke's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath the family concern. Harper, you're being emotional about this, sir. Mason's financial situation is genuinely urgent, and the market timing for property optimization is absolutely critical. If we wait too long, we'll miss development opportunities that might not come around again for years. Mason's gambling debts aren't my emergency, I said, watching her face carefully. The blood drained from her cheeks. How did you? That's not. Mason's business investments require careful capital management, that's all. I'd been guessing about the gambling, based on his pattern of regular financial crises and vague explanations about failed investments. But her reaction confirmed my suspicion. Mason's business loans and investment opportunities were covers for gambling debt consolidation. The pattern of regular emergency requests, the amounts always in the 8 to 15,000 range, the complete absence of any successful business ventures despite years of claimed entrepreneurial activity. The answer is still no, Brooke. She stood up without touching the expensive pastries, her mask of family concern finally slipping completely. You're making a serious mistake, Harper. This estate is too complex for someone with your limited experience. When you're overwhelmed and the properties start losing money, don't expect us to bail you out. The threat was poorly disguised as concern, but it revealed her desperation. She needed access to Ruby's estate to solve her own financial problems. Without it, her over-leveraged real estate portfolio would collapse within months, taking her lifestyle and social status with it. Friday morning brought a registered letter from their attorney demanding an emergency family meeting to resolve the growing estate management crisis before irreparable damage occurs to both family relationships and valuable property assets. The meeting was scheduled for Monday at the Riverside Country Club, where Brooke maintained membership despite her financial difficulties. The location choice was strategic. Brooke would be on familiar territory while I'd be the outsider. The country club setting would make me look unreasonable if I objected to their proposals. The other members and staff would witness any confrontation, creating social pressure to accept their terms gracefully rather than create a scene. I called Sarah immediately. They're trying to force me into signing by creating a public setting where I'll look like the problem if I refuse. Then we'll turn their tactic against them, Sarah replied with the confidence of someone who'd handled similar family conflicts before. I'll prepare comprehensive documentation of their financial history and your family support record. If they want a public discussion about competency and financial responsibility, they'll get more truth than they bargained for. Over the weekend, I compiled 4 years of financial data into a presentation that would have impressed my former corporate colleagues. Bank statements, loan documentation, property management records, tax returns, social media posts showing lifestyle inconsistencies. Everything organized with the precision of a major audit presentation designed to reveal patterns of financial misconduct. I also spent Saturday afternoon interviewing Ruby's tenants, documenting their perspectives on her management philosophy and their concerns about potential changes. The conversations reminded me why this fight was about more than money. It was about preserving a community that Ruby had spent decades nurturing. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd lived in Ruby's converted Victorian for 15 years with her husband and 3 children, cried when I explained the situation. Miss Ruby was like family to us, she said, holding my hands in her kitchen while her youngest daughter played at our feet. When my husband got sick and missed 3 months of work, she let us pay rent late without penalties or threats. When the furnace broke in January during that terrible cold snap, she had repairmen here within 2 hours, even though it was a Sunday. Her apartment was clean and comfortable, filled with family photos and children's artwork. The rent was $800 a month for a 2-bedroom unit that would cost $1,500 anywhere else downtown. These corporate landlords, they don't care about people, Mrs. Rodriguez continued. They just want money. They raise rent every year, charge fees for everything. Evict families for being 1 day late. Miss Ruby said housing was a right, not just a business. Mr. Patterson, retired from the post office and living on Social Security in a 1-bedroom unit for $400 a month, echoed her concerns. I've been here 12 years, he said from his recliner, surrounded by books and photographs of grandchildren. Ruby never raised my rent more than $20 at a time, even when other places were going up $50 or $60. She said old folks shouldn't have to choose between medicine and housing. His apartment was small but dignified, with a view of the park where he fed pigeons every morning. Market rate would be at least $800 for the same space. Their stories reminded me why Ruby's legacy mattered beyond the dollar amounts involved. She'd created stable homes for working families in a city where affordable housing was disappearing rapidly. Brooke and Mason saw underutilized assets. Ruby saw people who deserved dignity and security. Sunday evening, I called Jake, Brooke's son, who was finishing his senior year at the private school I'd been funding. At 18, he was old enough to understand what was happening and make his own decisions about family loyalty. "Aunt Harper, I heard about the estate situation," he said, his voice carrying embarrassment. "I want you to know I didn't ask for any of this. If you want to stop paying for school, I understand. I can get financial aid for college." The conversation was painful but necessary. Jake was a good kid who'd been caught in the middle of his mother's financial manipulation. "The school payments will continue through graduation," I told him. "But after that, you'll need to make your own arrangements. Your mother has been presenting these expenses as temporary assistance, but they've been going on for years." "I know," he said quietly. "I've tried to talk to her about getting a job to help, but she says I should focus on grades and extracurriculars. I feel terrible that you've been paying for everything." That conversation crystallized something important. Jake understood the difference between temporary help and permanent dependence. At 18, he had more financial integrity than his mother or uncle. Monday arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I drove downtown to the country club. I dressed in my best business suit, gathered my documentation into a professional briefcase, and prepared for what would either be surrender or declaration of war. Sarah met me in the parking lot with additional legal documents and a digital projector she'd borrowed from her office. "Remember, you're not defending yourself today," she said, checking her notes one final time. "You're presenting facts and letting them explain their own actions." The meeting room overlooked the golf course, its windows offering a view of perfectly manicured greens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. Brooke had arranged the seating to put me across from their attorney, with family members positioned on either side like a tribunal preparing to render judgment. Mason looked uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit that had probably been expensive when he bought it but now showed signs of financial stress: a missing button, worn cuffs, shoes that needed resolving. Brooke was impeccably dressed as always, but I noticed her jewelry was different. The diamond earrings and tennis bracelet she usually wore were missing, probably pawned or sold to maintain her lifestyle. Their attorney was a man in his 50s whose expensive clothes and confident demeanor suggested he specialized in intimidating people without significant legal resources. He'd probably handled dozens of similar family disputes, confident that emotional manipulation combined with legal complexity would produce the desired result. "Thank you all for coming," Brooke began, her tone suggesting she was chairing a board meeting rather than attempting a family coup. "We need to resolve Harper's resistance to professional estate management before her emotional attachment to Ruby's properties prevents rational financial decisions that could benefit everyone involved." The attorney slid papers across the table with practiced authority. "These revised documents address Harper's previous concerns while ensuring proper financial oversight for an estate of this magnitude. We've simplified the language and reduced the administrative requirements to make the transition as smooth as possible." I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I opened my briefcase and pulled out my laptop, connecting it to the projector Sarah had set up while they talked. "Before we discuss new documents, I think we should review the family financial history that's created this sense of urgency," I said, powering up the projector and watching their faces change as they realized what was coming. The first slide appeared on the wall behind me. Mason's financial requests, 2020 to 2024. 4 years of loan requests displayed in chronological order, with amounts, dates, stated purposes and repayment status. $87,000 in total requests, $0 in repayments. Mason shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing red. "Those were legitimate business loans between family members, Harper." "Let's look at the next slide," I said, clicking to display Brooke's financial history. Family expense sharing, 2021-2024. $82,000 in expenses she'd convinced me to pay as shared family responsibilities, but which I'd shouldered entirely. "Harper, this is completely inappropriate," Brooke said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Slide 3 shows the property management responsibilities I've handled for the past 3 years. Ruby's rental income, maintenance costs, tenant communications, vacancy rates, all documented month by month. Annual net profit had increased from $37,000 to $43,000 under my management, while tenant satisfaction had remained high and turnover low. This is a violation of financial privacy, their attorney interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the presentation. All of this information involves my personal financial records, Sarah replied smoothly. Harper has every right to present documentation of family financial relationships when her competency is being questioned. I advanced to slide 4, Mason's property transactions. His house purchase timeline, showing the down payment made 6 weeks after his most recent loan request from me. Purchase price, current listing price, and profit margin calculated using my money as initial investment capital. The room had gone completely silent except for the projector's cooling fan and the sound of Mason's uncomfortable breathing. Slide 5 documents Brooke's current financial position. Screenshots from public property records showing her debt-to-income ratios, over-leveraged portfolio, and monthly payments that exceeded her average income by significant margins. Brooke stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is stalking behavior, Harper. You can't just investigate family members like we're criminals. Slide 6 shows lifestyle documentation from social media, screenshots from both Mason's and Brooke's accounts, showing expensive vacations, casino visits, luxury purchases, restaurant meals that cost more than most people's grocery budgets, all posted within the past 6 months while they were claiming financial hardship and requesting assistance. Their attorney closed his briefcase with a sharp click. I think we've seen quite enough of this presentation. Actually, we're just getting to the relevant parts, I said, advancing to slide 7, Ruby's estate value and management requirements. $11.8 million in property assets, detailed breakdown of current income and expenses, management duties I'd been handling successfully, and my professional qualifications. I turned to face them directly, feeling calmer than I had since Ruby's death. The question isn't whether I'm competent to manage Ruby's estate, the question is why family members who've received $169,000 in financial support over 4 years, never repaid any loans, and maintained unsustainable lifestyles through my subsidies are questioning my financial judgment. Mason stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous, Harper. Family members help each other during difficult times, that's what family means. Exactly right, I said. For 4 years, I helped family members during difficult times. Now I'm establishing boundaries around continued assistance. What does that mean exactly? Brooke asked, though her expression suggested she already knew and dreaded the answer. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out a stack of legal documents Sarah had prepared over the weekend: promissory notes, payment schedules, formal loan agreements with interest rates and collection terms clearly specified. It means all outstanding loans are now due and payable according to formal repayment schedules, I said, sliding documents across the table to Mason. $87,000, with reasonable payment plans available if you prefer installments to lump sum repayment. More documents went to Brooke. Reimbursement requests for $82,000 in family expenses I shouldn't have paid alone, along with documentation supporting each claim. We don't have that kind of money available right now, Mason said, his voice rising with panic. Then you'll need to adjust your spending and lifestyle to accommodate debt repayment, like any responsible adult would do. Their attorney gathered his papers with obvious haste. My clients will need time to review these demands and consult with financial advisors. Of course, Sarah said pleasantly. They have 30 days to respond before we file collection actions through the court system. Brooke's composure finally shattered completely. You can't do this to family, Harper. This is vindictive and cruel. I'm not doing anything to family, I replied, closing my laptop with deliberate calm. I'm stopping what family has been doing to me for 4 years. The drive home felt like emerging from a dense fog that had been clouding my vision for longer than I'd realized. 4 years of systematic financial manipulation had ended with 1 hour of documented truth presented in a setting they'd chosen to intimidate me. That evening, I called all 23 tenants to personally assure them that nothing would change in their housing situation. The relief in their voices reminded me why this fight had been necessary. Mrs. Rodriguez cried openly. We were so scared about new owners, Miss Harper. People kept telling us that downtown properties always get sold to developers when owners die. This place has been our home for so long. Ruby always said the building belonged to the families who lived here, not just whoever held the deed. Mr. Patterson's voice shook with emotion. Ruby talked about you all the time, said you understood what she was trying to build here. Makes sense she'd leave everything to someone who shared her values instead of someone who just saw dollar signs. 3 weeks later, the consequences of my boundary setting began materializing with mathematical precision. Mason's house appeared on the market with a significant price reduction, suggesting urgent sale rather than patient profit-taking. Brooke's luxury SUV was repossessed from the country club parking lot during lunch, creating exactly the kind of public embarrassment she'd tried to orchestrate for me. Neither had called about family emergencies requiring immediate financial assistance. The pattern of regular crisis requests had stopped completely once formal repayment schedules were established. I didn't feel guilty about their financial difficulties. I felt free from the obligation to solve problems they'd created through their own choices. 6 months later, I received the first loan repayment from Mason. $500 toward his $87,000 debt, accompanied by a handwritten note apologizing for misunderstanding our previous financial arrangements. Brooke sent a check for $2,000 with a longer letter explaining her temporary cash flow problems and requesting extended payment terms. I deposited both checks and updated my spreadsheet tracking their repayment progress. Even small payments represented acknowledgement of debt and commitment to resolution. The most important change wasn't financial though, it was discovering that earned respect felt completely different from purchased peace. My relationships now were based on mutual appreciation rather than economic dependency. People valued my time, opinions, and company because they chose to, not because they needed access to my bank account. Ruby had left me far more than property and money. She'd left me an example of how to build something meaningful without compromising fundamental principles. The affordable housing she'd created would continue serving families for decades. The boundaries I'd established would prevent future financial exploitation. 12 months after Ruby's death, I stand in the renovated community room of her largest rental building, watching families gather for the monthly tenant meeting I'd instituted. Children play in the corner while parents discuss maintenance requests, community garden plans, and upcoming building improvements. The property management company Brooke had wanted to hire would have eliminated these gatherings as inefficient. They would have raised rents to market rates and evicted families who couldn't afford the increases. They would have maximized short-term profits while destroying the community Ruby had spent 60 years nurturing. Instead, the buildings generate steady income while providing stable homes for working families. Maintenance is handled promptly and fairly. Rent increases are limited to covering actual cost increases rather than profit maximization. Tenants are treated as community members rather than revenue sources. Today I manage Ruby's properties with the same methodical precision I once applied to corporate audits, but with the additional satisfaction of knowing that every decision honors both financial responsibility and human dignity. Maintenance schedules, tenant communications, financial planning, community development, all documented, systematic, and sustainable. Brooke and Mason still live in the same city, but our interactions are limited to formal communications about their debt repayment progress. Holiday gatherings are cordial but brief, with clear understanding that financial topics are off-limits unless they involve their scheduled payments. The most satisfying outcome wasn't their financial consequences, though those were appropriate and necessary. It was discovering my own capacity for calm, systematic boundary enforcement when principles were truly at stake. Ruby would have been proud of the preservation of her legacy and values. She'd spent 60 years building something worthwhile without compromising her commitment to community service over profit maximization. I'd spent 4 years learning the same lesson through documented experience rather than inherited wisdom, but the education was thorough and permanent. The lesson cost $169,000 in tuition, making it one of the most expensive courses I'd ever taken. But unlike most educational investments, this one came with ongoing practical applications, measurable results, and the satisfaction of knowing that principled decisions had produced sustainable outcomes. Sometimes the most important boundaries are the ones we establish with people who share our genetics but not our values. Professional competence and family loyalty aren't mutually exclusive concepts, but they require clear definitions, consistent enforcement, and the courage to choose integrity over emotional manipulation. Ruby's estate continues generating income while serving its original purpose of providing affordable housing for working families. My family relationships continue existing within sustainable parameters that respect both financial reality and personal dignity. And I continue applying systematic problem-solving approaches to personal situations that require both emotional intelligence and financial precision. 2 years after Ruby's death, I received a call that brought everything full circle. Jake, Brooke's son, was graduating from college with a degree in social work. He'd chosen a career path focused on helping families navigate financial crises, the kind of work that might have prevented his mother's exploitation patterns if she'd been willing to seek help instead of enabling Mason's gambling addiction. "Aunt Harper, I want to thank you for cutting off the payments when you did," he said during our phone conversation. "It forced me to grow up and take responsibility. I got scholarships, worked part-time, learned to budget. My mom was furious at first, but I think she eventually understood." Jake had also started attending Gamblers Anonymous family support meetings, trying to understand how Mason's addiction had affected the entire family dynamic. "I see now how everyone was enabling him," he said, "even me, by accepting money that came from his borrowing. We were all part of the cycle." The insight from an 18-year-old was more mature than anything I'd heard from the adults in our family. It confirmed that the boundaries I'd established weren't just about protecting Ruby's legacy, they were about breaking generational patterns of financial dysfunction. Mason's recovery had been slower and more painful. After losing his house and declaring bankruptcy, he'd finally admitted to his gambling addiction and entered treatment. The first payment he'd made toward his debt had come from his part-time job at a warehouse, earning $12 an hour and living in a studio apartment. "I'm paying back what I can," he'd written in a letter that accompanied his check. "It'll take years, maybe decades, but I understand now that the money was never mine to begin with. I used family loyalty as an excuse for theft." The brutal honesty of his acknowledgement had been more meaningful than the $500 because it represented genuine understanding rather than strategic apology. Brooke's journey had been different. Rather than seeking help or acknowledging her financial irresponsibility, she'd doubled down on resentment and blame. Her real estate license had been suspended after client complaints about missed deadlines and unprofessional behavior. The stress of her financial collapse had affected her work performance, creating a downward spiral that ended with her leaving the city entirely. She'd moved back to our hometown, working retail and living with our elderly aunt while trying to rebuild her credit. We exchanged Christmas cards but nothing more. The relationship had been casualties of her unwillingness to acknowledge her role in the exploitation pattern. But the most profound changes weren't in my family relationships, they were in the community Ruby had built. The monthly tenant meetings had evolved into something more significant. Families began organizing childcare cooperatives, sharing meals during difficult times, creating informal support networks that extended beyond housing. Mrs. Rodriguez had started a weekend food program, using the community room to distribute groceries to families facing temporary hardships. Mr. Patterson taught financial literacy classes, sharing decades of wisdom about budgeting and saving. The buildings had become more than affordable housing, they'd become a model for community-based mutual aid. 3 years after the confrontation at the country club, I stood in Ruby's diner, being now restored, and operating as a community cafe, watching the lunch crowd that included both longtime tenants and new downtown residents. The menu featured affordable options alongside more expensive items, creating a space where people from different economic backgrounds could share the same tables. The renovation had been funded through careful reinvestment of rental profits, exactly as Ruby would have wanted. No one had been displaced, no families had been forced to move due to gentrification, no community connections had been severed for the sake of higher returns. The financial success had been steady rather than dramatic. The properties now generated enough income to cover all expenses, fund ongoing improvements, provide modest returns on investment, and support the community programs that made the buildings more than just rental units. Looking back through my meticulously maintained records, I could trace the complete transformation from financial victim to empowered administrator. The spreadsheets told a story of systematic change, decreasing family financial requests, increasing property values, stable tenant relationships, growing community engagement. But the numbers only captured part of the transformation. The real change had been internal, the development of confidence in my own judgment, the ability to distinguish between manipulation and genuine need, the courage to enforce boundaries even when family members claimed I was being cruel or selfish. Ruby's legacy lived on not just in the physical buildings she'd left behind, but in the principles she demonstrated throughout her life. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. That true family relationships are based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. That building something lasting requires saying no to immediate gratification and short-term gains. The lesson had cost $169,000 in tuition, but it had paid dividends far beyond money. I'd learned to recognize my own worth, to trust my own competence, to value relationships that enhanced rather than depleted my emotional and financial resources. The transformation from financial doormat to boundary-enforcing administrator wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was methodical, thoroughly documented, and permanently sustainable. Exactly the way Ruby would have handled similar challenges, with quiet competence and unwavering commitment to doing the right thing regardless of family pressure or social expectations. 5 years later, standing in the apartment where Ruby had lived her final years, now converted into a small museum documenting the history of affordable housing in our city, I understand that her true inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge that some things are worth protecting, some boundaries are worth defending, and some legacies are worth preserving regardless of the personal cost. The financial records from those early days of exploitation read like evidence from a different lifetime. The person who had automatically paid every family expense, who had never questioned repeated loan requests, who had assumed that family loyalty required unlimited financial support, that person felt like a stranger to me now. In her place stood someone who understood that true generosity requires wisdom, that real love includes accountability, and that the most important legacy you can leave isn't money in the bank but principles worth defending and communities worth preserving. Ruby would have been proud not just of the preservation of her properties and values, but of the woman I'd become through the process of defending them. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what someone leaves you, but what you discover about yourself while protecting what they valued most.